Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Riprap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Susan Douglas. Today we'll be discussing her latest book, Enlightened Sexism, the seductive message that feminism's work has done. Welcome to Riprap again, Susan.
Thanks for having me.
As I was talking to you before, I felt that this book is just wicked fun in a very good sense, and it's very well written. But maybe we can start by explaining what you mean by enlightened sexism.
Sure. Enlightened sexism is a sneaky, subtle, new kind of sexism that seems to accept and even celebrate women's achievements on the surface, but underneath is really dedicated to the undoing of feminism and to keeping women, and especially young women, in their place.
And there's this illusion that all is done now with feminism. It's all going the way it should go, and everyone's got what they want.
Yeah, there are fantasies of power that we get, and this was really interesting for me when I started working on this book. And I started on it because I'd done this book, Where the Girls Are, back in the 90s, but by the early 2000s, when I would go to give talks about it, popular culture doesn't have that long a shelf life, and people started saying, well, what about Buffy? What about Ally McBeal? What about Desperate Housewives? And so I thought I'd go back to the 90s, which is where the Girls Are left off, and look up to the present. And so as I was watching, I began to be struck by this big difference between what was on offer for me and what was on offer for my then teenage daughter. And so if you think about the 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock strip at night on television, what are women doing? They're district attorneys, they're cops, they're law partners, they're surgeons, they're judges. The glass ceiling, done and done on all of those shows. So ironically, they've come to overrepresent how far women have come, and I began to be sort of struck by that. And on the other hand, I was watching what was on offer for my daughter. A lot of reality TV stuff on MTV, and competition shows about modeling and bachelors and all the rest. And that stuff was pretty retrograde. And so, I began to say, what's wrong with this picture? And so for me, I was getting all of this role model imagery that overrepresented how far women had come. And for her, a lot of this kind of programming is very ironic. It basically sticks an elbow in the ribs of young people and says, we know that you know that we know that you know that it's stupid to be sexist. Therefore, it's silly to be sexist. Therefore, it's funny to be sexist. Therefore, it's okay to be sexist, because these images can't really hurt us anymore, because you young women have it made in the shade. So even though we have these very different kinds of programs, motivated by very different kinds of desires and imperatives, together they both suggest that women's equality is fully achieved when it's not.
Well, I got a real taste of this when I talked with some of my students, and boy, you dig under the surface and you get exactly this phenomenon that they think, well, they've all got it made, or they have all these different issues about what they think feminism is, and it isn't. I thought one of the things that was fascinating in the book is that you had a real reality check about where women really are in terms of jobs and pay.
Yeah, I just gave a lecture in my intro to mass comm class this past week, and in the PowerPoints I juxtapose images of the Real Housewives of New York or New Jersey, or Orange County, very privileged women, or Gossip Girl, some of these other images of women in which there is no such thing as financial insecurity at all, and juxtapose those with some pretty sobering statistics. So, if you just watch television, you would think women have achieved full equality. But if you look at the statistics, they tell a pretty different story. The top 5 jobs for women aren't, president, as we've had in commander-in-chief or 24, not to mention law partner or chief of police. They're secretaries, waitresses, cashiers, child care workers, and nearly half of women, 43%, are confined to just 20 occupations in which the median salary is $27,000 a year. It is awfully tough to live on $27,000 a year. You know, and I could go on with this. So college women hear some of these statistics, and they think, well, you know, that's working class women or women who didn't go to college. A year out of school, college women are making 80% of what their male counterparts are.
That's what I thought was so devastating, is that it's all the way through, up through all the professions.
That's right, and 10 years out they're making 69%. And you know, some of this has to do with the jobs they go into, some of this has to do with taking time out to have children, because we have such terrible public policies for women, children, and families in this country. Some of it has to do with another really interesting figure about young men being 4 times more likely to negotiate their first salary and to continue negotiating their salaries, which over the years results in a $500,000 differential in pay.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So, you know, on one level, I think young women, they've been raised as the girl power generation. They have been told, especially if they were destined for college, that they could do anything they want and be anything they want, and they want to believe that. And of course, their parents want them to believe that too. But the reality, once they get out of school, is a bit different.
And the change doesn't come without a struggle. I mean, I think that's part of it, is just step into it, get whatever you want, but that's not where the improvements that have happened have been with that struggle.
Well, you know, for young women today, feminism is just so vilified, and it's really hard to think of a social movement in this country that has done so much for so many people, not just women, but men too, that has been so demonized, you know, in the mass media, and so they don't, you know, they don't want to go near feminism. And I think one of the things that has happened is that feminists are, of course, stereotyped as strident, humorless, anti-fashion, man-hating, child-loathing, you know, on and on and on. And the exhilaration of the women's movement, how much fun it was actually to have this struggle. It was fun to take on power structures. It was fun to take on men who were treating you very shabbily. But that has been very much erased from our history. And so, you know, the notion of the importance of struggle, as you said, isn't there. But there's also kind of a fear of that struggle, that if women begin to, you know, stake their claim to fighting for themselves again, they're either going to be marginalized in the way that feminists are, but also that the struggle is going to be scary instead of, in fact, being gratifying.
Which would probably be a feature of an androcentric power structure, I would think. You know, we need to keep things the same. Don't threaten us too much.
Right,
You have a little room to play with. One of the things you talk about is the war between embedded feminism and the enlightened sexism.
Yeah, you know, people have asked me about, well, where did you get this term, enlightened sexism? And there's been a term, post-feminism, that has been bandied about a lot to describe this kind of situation we're in, where the gains of the women's movement are taken for granted, full equality has allegedly been achieved, and so now there can be some backsliding. In fact, you know, now it's perfectly okay to have retrograde sexist images of women because they can't hurt us anymore. But you know, that term, post-feminism, has been gummed up by a lot of different definitions. There have been debates about it in the academy, about what it means, what it should mean. And after a while I thought, wait a minute, this condition that we're seeing, it doesn't have anything to do with feminism. It has to do with good old-fashioned grade A patriarchy and good old-fashioned grade A sexism. It just looks more enlightened than, you know, your you know, out and out in your face sexism. And so that term seemed much more useful to me.
I think it is. It really is. And along with it, this whole idea that there aren't any barriers anymore for women, that they,
well,
like you were saying.
This does get back to the other term you asked me about, embedded feminism. back when the women's movement was really taking on the power structure in the late 60s and early 70s, and certainly taking on the images of women in the media, feminism was completely outside of, the cultural mainstream, and it was outside of the mass media, And now that's not the case. We have had showrunners and producers and show creators who were feminists. So when Joss Whedon, created Buffy, this is a self-proclaimed feminist guy who was sick and tired of seeing young women always be the victims in horror movies. He wanted one of them finally to get the chance to be a hero. If you look at Shonda Rhimes' Grey's Anatomy, she wanted to create a diverse, multi-ethnic, multiracial hospital scenario in which women had just as much ambition and power as men. So with these kinds of shows, and obviously we could name a lot more, feminism isn't outside anymore. It is embedded into kind of the Western warp of our media fabric and our cultural fabric. But it isn't there by itself. And so enlightened sexism and embedded feminism are constantly in struggle with each other. And what this means for women, and especially young women, is they are confronted with these contradictions that it's very difficult to straddle.
One of the threads that, throughout your book centers on how the media must explicitly acknowledge feminism, point to it and take it into account in order to argue that it is no longer needed a spent force. And I think that's in line with what you were just saying, is that we need to address that. It's not old-fashioned, it's withered, humorless, repulsive. It's a vital part of the struggle.
Well, it is a vital part, but what I meant by this, and I drew on this idea from Angela McRobbie, who is a very eminent British feminist scholar. And I'll just give you a couple of examples, but the standard way this is done is you have a character who is a feminist. She is identified as a feminist, whether it's in Ally McBeal or in Bridget Jones' Diary or whatever. And she is humorless, strident, inflexible, and so on and so forth. And so just by her enacting who she is, it shows that feminism is out of date, it's out of touch with what young women want and need. And I can give you two examples from two very popular film texts, Legally Blonde and Miss Congeniality, which a lot of people have seen. These are, little spritzes of movies. And so in Legally Blonde, we have Reese Witherspoon playing a very girly, seemingly at first dumb blonde from Southern California who goes to Harvard Law because her ex-boyfriend has gone there and she's trying to get him back. And one of the first women she meets is a self-proclaimed feminist who is very mean to Elle, and we see her at a party. She's of course a lesbian, and she's very verbally aggressive to people. And at this party, she's having this impassioned debate with one of her fellow law students about the term semester, which she thinks is a sexist term because it starts with SEM, which was related to a certain byproduct of the male body, and she thinks semester should be changed to ovester because that's a more female-friendly term. So what does this suggest? It suggests that feminists are interested in the most symbolically stupid, banal, irrelevant issues, when in fact that's quite the opposite. And in Miss Congeniality, Sandra Bullock plays an FBI agent who has to go undercover at a beauty pageant because there's suspected to be a crime about to happen there. And she is absolutely, in the beginning of the film, completely anti-feminine in every way, and launches on all of these feminist rants about beauty contests. But she goes through a makeover, and of course by the end of the movie she's embracing beauty pageants as liberating. And so these are they're funny, but they're very subtle ways in which feminism is taken into account to show that it is dowdy, aggrieved, old-fashioned, out of touch, and something young women should shun like anthrax.
At the same time, they're using feminist concepts of really doing your research and, taking it, doing the confrontation if you have to, and doing it very effectively.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that Legally Blonde, it all revolved around whether you got your hair wet after having a perm, I guess.
Exactly. And look, I've seen both of these movies many, many times. So I love them and hate them, They are both delicious in a variety of ways, but what's the fantasy about Legally Blonde? That girly information, that information that young women and women have to have actually matters. That it could be just as important as knowing who won the Super Bowl in 1992. Why is one piece of knowledge more irrelevant than the other? But in our culture it is. And so, that's the kind of fantasy women want to sink into for an hour and a half.
Well, and then there's Beverly Hills 90210, which you talk about a fair amount in the book.
Yeah, I start the book with 90210. And what was really interesting about this book is going back to the early 90s and being reminded how much feminist ferment there was. 1992 was declared the year of the woman because so many women, an unprecedented number of women, ran for Congress because they were so furious over how Anita Hill had been treated during the Clarence Thomas hearings. And there were several books and studies that had come out about women, young women being discriminated against in very subtle, unconscious ways in math and science classes. There began to be, there were all these Take Back the Night rallies. So there was a lot of feminist agitation. It was very interesting to be reminded of that. And at the same time, teenage girls were discovered as a very important market. And 90210, when it premiered, was like, 69th out of 70th in the rankings in the fall of the year it premiered. By the following summer, it was the #1 show among teenagers and teenage girls. And that show had a pretty different agenda from the girl power, stream in our culture. And it was really about tying teenagers to consumerism, conspicuous consumption, and of course at the same time acknowledging their concerns about dating and alcohol abuse and all the rest. But it was really fun to go back and look at that show again.
And how the market influenced.
Yeah.
I found it fascinating that you evaluate women in the public space so effectively and devastating accuracy. I really thought that was interesting. And some of the examples that came to mind included people like Oprah Winfrey, who owns her own production company now, and she started from sort of nowhere and then came in, and Wanda Sykes and Janet Reno and Hillary Clinton and Sarah Palin.
Well, where to start? We could start with Janet Reno in a way. I was very interested in what happened in the aftermath of this Year of the Woman, when more women did get elected to Congress, when Bill Clinton was very committed to appointing women to positions of power in his administration, and when he did appoint Janet Reno to be the first female Attorney General. And, initially after Waco, the whole disaster in Waco, when she authorized the FBI to go in and there was a terrible, consequence of death and destruction, and she immediately took responsibility for it right away. She became something of a folk hero because she was so upfront about taking responsibility for that. And, as her tenure progressed, Janet Reno became an almost constant topic of late-night stand-up jokes on Letterman and Leno, and eventually became the target of Will Ferrell's Janet Reno's Dance Party on Saturday Night Live. And so I was very interested in these Janet Reno jokes and why they were incessant. And so if you look at Janet Reno, you know, this is a time when there's a lot of debate and uncertainty about, you know, the prevailing gender regime in the country. How much power is girl power going to mean? How much power did Hillary Clinton really have in that presidency? Janet Reno was somebody who looked at the masquerade of femininity that women are supposed to put on every morning, and she just said no. She just said no. She did, you know, she had a slight concession to a little lipstick, and she did wear a blue suit, but her body language, the way she spoke, all of it was wrong. And that's very threatening in a country that is as obsessed with gender as we are. And because what if every woman looked at Janet Reno and said, hey, she's just said no to having to, you know, act and look and behave in this way, and she's one of the most successful women in the country. So that's very threatening, and it has to be policed. And it's not that anybody sat down consciously and did so. It just emerged out of the kind of national, and I would say male subconscious, and it gave rise to all of these jokes that made fun of her for being too mannish, for being asexual, for being lonely, so I was very struck by how this very successful woman also at the same time got very policed in the public sphere through humor.
And she was so powerful. I mean, she really set a powerful you know, example, and that's, I think, something that really set people back, you know.
Yeah.
My God, a woman is doing that, you know.
Well, we have such anxiety still about women and power. If you look at the months leading up to Katie Couric becoming the first female soul anchor, there was so much speculation that she was going to tank, and you know, it was almost a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way. If you looked at the glee that surrounded Martha Stewart's you know, eventual conviction and going to prison compared to the Enron guys who did a lot more damage to a lot more people. And then if you look at the campaign coverage of Hillary Clinton and Sarah Palin, you again see these enormous anxieties about women in power. Now, Hillary Clinton eventually called out the sexism that surrounded her coverage, and she wasn't alone. There were a lot of women, and men for that matter, who were furious with all of the stuff that Glenn Beck and Chris Matthews and all of these guys said about her. You know, that when you hear her voice, you hear "take out the garbage." I mean, Glenn Beck actually did call her a bitch on his radio show. I mean, this coverage was horrible. They were shocked that she might actually cry in New Hampshire, you know, as if feminists have their tear ducts removed, you know, at birth or something. So because Hillary Clinton is not just a woman in politics, Hillary Clinton is a feminist, and Sarah Palin is not. And to my way of thinking, Hillary Clinton is a much more learned, accomplished, thoughtful, interesting woman than Sarah Palin is. But Sarah Palin, until, you know, the McCain guys went on her for quote-unquote going rogue, you know, after the election, she actually got much better coverage in a way than Hillary Clinton did, or at least less critical coverage.
Well, she electrified the convention when she spoke. I mean, it was...
Yes, she did, although that was speaking to, you know, a Republican base, which
yeah,
she...
well,
which
I'm not saying that it wasn't a biased crowd,
right.
which it was, but still it was more than what, you know, John McCain got.
Absolutely, and she still electrifies crowds. She still does. She's become a celebrity in her own right, and I think that the difference is that Sarah Palin is not a feminist. She embraces femininity. She stands against almost everything that feminism has fought for. She's interesting, though, because despite the big hair and the short skirts and the peep-toe shoes and all the rest, the thing about Sarah Palin is she's tough. She's gutsy. She's actually can be mean. She can have elements of a kind of macho masculinity that blend with this kind of hyper femininity that I think make her kind of compelling to a lot of people.
Well, that's the thing that repulses me, but there is that sense of the scent of blood. I mean,
Yeah.
in what she's doing. She's taking it to people right up, and some people really enjoy that, and some people don't. But I found it interesting in your book that you didn't call her out on a personal level, but you disagreed with her position in terms of femininity, you know, the feminism, I should say. And I thought that was a kind and very competent reading of what she's doing. And just like you're saying, you know, there's things that she's doing, you can't deny that she has a certain cachet with certain groups in the country and knows how to work it, you know, when she gets up there to speak. I mean, it's every line seems like an applause line, you know, that she's, but the concern I have is when you're doing that, it comes back on you, because then people are starting to expect that what you're saying is going to come true. And I worry about when her first reaction to some of this latest stuff is, well, lock and reload, you know, and then there's this violence, it's the rhetoric.
Right,
You know?
right. No, but if you think about that rhetoric, lock and reload, that is very masculine
Oh, yeah.
rhetoric, dressed up in big curly hair and a tight-fitting black leather jacket and, you know, lipstick. And I think that's one of the reasons she gets away with this in a way. She kind of, because of her appearance, she seems to soften the blow of this language, which is in fact quite inflammatory and,
It's very inflammatory.
and irresponsible.
Yeah, and that's what I'm concerned about in terms of the national discourse, is that you start doing this inflammatory stuff and people start believing it and want to practice it, and then you have people acting it out. And this is a country known for its assassinations, so not a place to do that. One of the things you said in the book is that women are accepted as long as they did not conform. You know, in other words, they didn't comply with the sexism. You know, if they they're accepted as long as they didn't challenge, I think, the sexist parameters.
Right. I mean, you know, I think if we look back at Hillary Clinton's campaign, for example, she was in an almost impossible position because she was known as a feminist. She's also an attractive woman, and she had to constantly figure out how to walk this line between feminism on the one hand and femininity on the other. And that's been true for so many women in public. And you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. It's a very, very tough line to walk. But if you challenge you know, the sort of existing power structure, or even seem like you might, you're way too threatening. I mean, look at what happened to Michelle Obama. I mean, here is one accomplished, smart, savvy, and also beautiful woman. And, you know, as soon as this quotation came out, you know, I'm proud of my country, you know, she was lacerated as being an angry black woman. And at the same time, so on the one hand, she was lacerated for fitting into a stereotype to which she does not fit at all, of the kind of fearsome black matriarch. And on the other hand, she was kind of diminished as only a fashion plate, or primarily a fashion plate. And since coming into office, she has had to be very careful about not getting involved in policy issues that we know she's smart about.
But it's a great book. I really enjoyed reading it, and I hope other people will. And it is wicked fun.
Well, thanks so much.
Thanks for being on Riprap.
Thanks for having me.